All right, so what I want to do today is do a little bit more work with if-elses, if and elses and else if. And we're going to enter a grade and then figure out what letter grade that integer value grade represents. Okay, so first off, I want to check between 0 and 100 to make sure it is a valid grade. I don't want to enter a -5 or I'm assuming there's no extra credit, so 110 is not a valid grade to input. So how do I do that? There are two ways to do that, and one is considered a positive check. In other words, that it is a good value. I want to check for a good value. And there is a negative check. I'll check for a bad value. So if statements, they want to evaluate a Boolean condition or a true-false condition. Whatever condition is evaluated to that true or false, then if it's a true, the body of the if statement will execute if when the if statement is true. Okay. Then you have an else that will execute when the if statement is false. And that's always the case. So if this is true, then if grade, let's make a positive check. I want it to execute the if it's a good value, in other words. So if it's between and including a 0 and the grade is less than or equal to a 100, then I know those are good values. Then I can test here and say good value. Well, let's say maybe a valid value was entered. Okay. And then down here, then I would know that this is not a valid value. Out, invalid value was entered. Might be better to put, instead of just a value, that's too generic. Let's say a grade, some way here, a grade. And now let's just test that and see if it works. Okay, so let's run that. I'm going to enter a 50, which is a valid grade, and it says valid grade was entered. Now let's test an invalid grade. Let's say a -50, so that's way out of range, and it says invalid was entered. I'll test it again with a 110, and it says invalid. Now I'm going to test it with a boundary. A boundary is the value that is the maximum range before it goes to an invalid value. So 100 is supposed to be valid. So valid in grade, and then let's run it again and test for the other side of the boundary, or a 101, and those are the better tests to do. Testing a 50 and a positive 110, a -50, those are way out of bounds, and those are not very good tests. What you want to do is test the boundaries. Okay, so let's test the bottom boundary of a 0. That's a valid grade. So let's test a -1. On the other side of the boundary is invalid. So now I know I have a good value when I'm supposed to, and an incorrect value or grade when I'm supposed to. All right. So that's called the boundary test. Now here, what if I wanted to change that to have a negative test instead of a positive test? So in other words, I want to check to see if it's out of range rather than in range. Well, here then I would want to say if it's less than 0, or what I use an or an and there. Well, there's no way I could be less than 0 and greater than 100. So it's going to have to be an or grade is greater than 100. Then these two values change, or the two executions change as far as what it's testing for. And I have an invalid grade here, for example, and now I have a valid grade on the else. So let's test that and make sure that works. Run. Let's test a 100, and that's a valid entry. Let's test a 101, invalid, so that looks correct. Let's test a 0, and then my other side of the bounds, a -1. So it looks like we're working correct. So here again, you have two tests we could run, and then depending on whether you want a positive check for the if or a negative check, then this is how you'll go about that, using the or for the range or an and for the range.